The warehouse stood at the edge of Newark, New Jersey, where the city's lights faded into industrial darkness. It was a place forgotten by maps, known only to those who dealt in secrets and sins. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rust and cold concrete. Water dripped from old pipes overhead, each drop echoing through the empty space like a metronome, counting down the hours of someone's life. Don Carlo Mancini stood alone in a back room, illuminated only by a single flickering bulb that swung gently from a frayed wire. The light cast moving shadows across his face, revealing deep lines carved by decades of violence and control. He was in his late 50s, his hair more salt than pepper now, his shoulders still broad, but carrying a weight that had nothing to do with physical strength. Before him was a stainless steel sink, the kind you'd find in a restaurant kitchen or a butcher's shop. The water ran clear at first, then pink, then red, as he scrubbed his hands methodically, almost ritually. The latex gloves lay discarded on the floor beside him, torn and stained. His movements were practiced, efficient, devoid of emotion. He had done this hundreds of times before. Outside, the November wind howled against the metal walls of the warehouse, rattling the loose panels and whistling through gaps in the structure. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, the kind that made you want to huddle somewhere warm with people you loved. But Carlo Mancini had no such place anymore. His empire was built on fear, and fear kept everyone at a distance, even those who claimed loyalty. He had been the undisputed boss of the Mancini crime family for over 20 years. His name was whispered in back rooms from Newark to Philadelphia. Politicians feared his influence, rival families respected his ruthlessness, and the streets knew that crossing Don Carlo meant disappearing without a trace. He had built an empire on the foundation of absolute control, and he maintained it through calculated violence and unwavering discipline. Tonight had been no different. Another problem had been solved, another threat eliminated. The details didn't matter anymore. They all blurred together after a while. Names became faces, faces became bodies, and bodies became memories that faded like smoke. He told himself he didn't feel guilt. Guilt was a luxury for people who had the privilege of conscience, and Carlo had buried his conscience the same day he buried his son, Antonio. The name still hurt to think even after all these years. 15 years had passed since that morning when his world shattered. Antonio had been 12 years old, bright-eyed, and full of dreams that had nothing to do with the family business. He wanted to be an architect, to build things instead of destroy them. He loved drawing buildings, imagining structures that reached toward the sky. Carlo had indulged him, even though he knew that eventually the boy would have to understand the reality of their world. But Antonio never got the chance to understand anything. He was caught in crossfire, meant for his father, a retaliation attack orchestrated by a rival family trying to send a message. The bullets weren't meant for a child, but in their world, innocence offered no protection. Carlo had held his son's body in his arms in the middle of a crowded street while people screamed and scattered. He remembered the weight of him, how small he felt, how the life drained out of his eyes while sirens wailed in the distance. After that day, something inside Carlo died too. He became colder, harder, more calculating. He eliminated the rival family completely, not leaving a single member alive, but the victory felt hollow. No amount of revenge could bring Antonio back, and no amount of power could fill the void his son's death had created. So Carlo did what he knew best. He buried the pain deep, covered it with layers of control and dominance, and told himself that feeling nothing was better than feeling everything. He reached for a towel hanging on a hook beside the sink, his hands now clean but still tingling from the harsh soap and cold water. The warehouse was silent, except for the dripping and the wind. His men had left hours ago, following his orders to give him privacy. They knew better than to linger when the boss wanted to be alone. As he dried his hands, Carlo caught his reflection in a cracked mirror mounted on the wall. The face staring back at him was almost unrecognizable from the man he used to be. Where there had once been warmth in his eyes, now there was only ice. Where there had once been the suggestion of a smile, now there were only hard lines and shadows. He looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the stranger in the mirror. That's when he heard them. Soft footsteps, small and hesitant, coming from somewhere in the darkness of the warehouse. Carlo's instincts kicked in immediately. His hand moved to the gun tucked in his waistband, fingers wrapping around the cold metal grip. No one should be here. The building was supposed to be empty. His pulse quickened as adrenaline flooded his system, sharpening his senses. He turned slowly, pulling the gun out and holding it ready. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by a sound he couldn't immediately identify, a soft scraping, like plastic wheels on concrete. His eyes narrowed as a small figure emerged from the shadows into the pool of light cast by the overhead bulb. It was a child. A boy, no more than 8 years old, stood in the doorway of the room. He was small and thin, wearing an oversized jacket that had seen better days and jeans with worn knees. His sneakers were scuffed and dirty. His face was smudged with grime, as if he had been playing in places children shouldn't play. But what struck Carlo most were the boy's eyes, large, dark, and calm. There was no fear in them, only a kind of quiet observation that seemed far too old for such a young face. In the boy's hands was a small toy car, red and battered, the kind you could buy at any dollar store. He clutched it like it was precious, his fingers wrapped tightly around the plastic body. Carlo stood frozen, the gun still raised but his hand trembling slightly. He had pointed weapons at countless people over the years, men who begged for their lives, rivals who spat curses at him, informants who promised anything to survive, but never at a child. Never at someone who looked at him with such innocent directness. The boy's eyes flickered to Carlo's hands, and his small voice broke the silence, soft but clear in the empty warehouse. The words cut through the air like a blade through silk, simple but devastating in their impact. Carlo's breath caught in his throat. The gun lowered slowly, almost involuntarily, as the child's question echoed in his mind. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as memories flooded back with overwhelming force. Antonio's laugh, the way his son's small hand felt in his. The last time they had spoken, arguing about something trivial that Carlo couldn't even remember now. He took a step back, his legs suddenly unsteady. The tough exterior he had built so carefully, the armor that had protected him from feeling anything for 15 years, developed its first crack. And through that crack, something he had thought long dead began to stir. Not quite grief, not quite regret, but something that hurt more than any physical wound ever could. Carlo's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stood there, gun hanging loosely at his side, staring at the small boy who had somehow penetrated the fortress of his solitude. The warehouse seemed to grow colder, the dripping water louder, every sense heightened as his mind struggled to process what was happening. The boy didn't seem frightened by the gun, or by the blood-stained sink, or by the dangerous man standing before him. He simply stood there, rolling the toy car slightly between his palms, waiting. His composure was unsettling. Children should be afraid in places like this, should run or cry or hide. But this boy just watched with those old, knowing eyes. Carlo finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended, barely more than a whisper. The question hung in the air between them. Who was this child? How had he gotten in? Why was he here in a place that dealt in death and darkness? The boy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and when he spoke, his voice carried a maturity that didn't match his small frame. He explained that his mother worked here, that she was one of the cleaning staff who came late at night after the business had concluded. She worked in silence, invisible to the men who used this place, scrubbing away evidence and maintaining the anonymity that such operations required. Carlo's mind raced. He knew there was a cleaning crew, of course. He paid them well for their discretion and their willingness to work at odd hours without asking questions. But he had never considered that one of them might bring a child, might have a life beyond the walls of this warehouse that intersected with his own dark world. The boy continued, his words simple but profound. He said that his mother had told him about Carlo, about the man who used to smile before something made him sad. The statement hit Carlo like a physical blow. Used to smile. Had he ever smiled? It seemed like another lifetime, another person entirely. Before Antonio's death, maybe there had been moments of genuine happiness, brief respites from the constant pressure of leadership. But those moments felt like they belonged to a stranger. Carlo turned away, unable to maintain eye contact with the child. He faced the sink again, his hands gripping the cold metal edge as he tried to steady himself. Behind him he could hear the boy's footsteps, moving closer rather than farther away. Most people moved away from Carlo Mancini. They kept their distance, maintained the buffer of fear and respect that his reputation demanded. But this child approached him like he was just a man, nothing more and nothing less. The boy began to talk, his voice filling the silence of the warehouse with words that shouldn't have had power but somehow did. He talked about his mother, about how hard she worked, cleaning buildings at night so she could be home during the day when he got out of school. He talked about his dreams of becoming a scientist, about experiments he wanted to try and questions he wanted to answer about how the world worked. And then he talked about his father, the man who had left years ago and never came home. The boy's voice didn't waver when he spoke about this, didn't fill with self-pity or anger. He simply stated it as a fact of his life, the same way he might describe the color of the sky or the weather outside. His father was gone, and he and his mother managed without him. Each word the boy spoke seemed to peel away another layer of the armor Carlo had constructed around himself. The casual mention of an absent father, the matter-of-fact way the child described his life, the simple dignity in his voice despite obvious hardship. All of it resonated with something deep inside Carlo that he had tried to kill. He thought about Antonio, about all the time they had lost, about all the moments they would never have. His son would have been 27 now, possibly with children of his own. Carlo might have been a grandfather, might have had a reason to smile again, might have found a path back to something resembling humanity. But that future had been stolen, and in its place was this, a cold warehouse, blood-stained sinks, and an endless parade of violence that accomplished nothing except maintaining a kingdom of fear. The boy moved even closer, and Carlo could sense him standing just a few feet behind. He could hear the soft sound of the toy car's wheels being rolled along the boy's palm. A nervous gesture, perhaps, or maybe just the instinctive play of a child who found comfort in familiar objects. Then the boy said something about his mother's observations, about how she had watched Carlo over the months she'd been working here. She had noticed things. The way he stood alone long after everyone else left, the way he washed his hands over and over as if trying to scrub away more than just physical stains, the way his face held no expression, but his eyes held everything. She had told her son that sometimes people get lost in their sadness, that they forget there's another way to live. Carlo felt his throat tighten. The idea that someone had been watching him, seeing through the facade he presented to the world, was both terrifying and oddly comforting. He had spent so long maintaining the image of the untouchable Don, the man who felt nothing and feared nothing, that he had almost convinced himself it was true. But this cleaning woman, someone he had probably never even looked at directly, had seen the truth. The boy asked another question then, his young voice curious rather than accusatory. He wanted to know what Carlo's son had been like, what made him happy, what they used to do together. The questions were innocent, the natural curiosity of a child trying to understand the adults around him. But to Carlo, they felt like daggers, each one finding a vulnerable spot that had never fully healed. For a long moment, Carlo said nothing. He stood there, hands gripping the sink, shoulders tense, fighting against the wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He had not spoken about Antonio in years. His wife had left him not long after the funeral, unable to bear the weight of their shared grief or the dangerous world that had stolen their child. His closest associates knew better than to mention the past. The subject was forbidden, buried under years of silence and willful forgetting. But something about this moment, about this child standing in the darkness of a warehouse where death was planned and executed, broke through Carlo's defenses. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the cumulative weight of 15 years of suppressed grief, or maybe it was simply that the boy asked in a way that demanded honesty, that treated the topic with a respect that adults rarely showed. Carlo began to speak, his voice low and rough, barely carrying across the small room. He talked about Antonio, about the boy who loved to draw buildings and dream of cities he would design. He talked about Saturday mornings when they would go to construction sites, Antonio's sketchbook always in hand, his eyes wide with wonder as he watched cranes lift steel beams and workers shape concrete into structures that would stand for generations. He talked about how Antonio had been gentle in a family that valued strength, how he had been curious in a world that demanded obedience, how he had been full of life in an environment shadowed by death. Carlo's voice cracked as he described the last time he saw his son alive, a mundane morning argument about homework or chores or something equally insignificant. They had parted with tension between them, and then Antonio was gone, and Carlo never got the chance to say the things that mattered. Behind him, the boy listened in silence, and Carlo could feel the weight of that attention, the simple act of being heard. When he finally finished speaking, when the words ran out and the silence returned, Carlo felt simultaneously empty and full, drained by the confession but somehow lighter for having spoken the truth aloud. The boy moved then, coming to stand beside Carlo at the sink. He was so small that his head barely reached Carlo's elbow. He looked down at the drain where the water had carried away the blood, then back up at Carlo's face. What he said next would stay with Carlo for the rest of his life. The boy observed that being sad wouldn't bring back Carlo's son, just like being angry wouldn't bring back his own father. But maybe, he suggested with the simple wisdom of childhood, remembering the people they missed could help them become the kind of men those people would have wanted them to be. The words settled over Carlo like snow, soft but undeniable, covering everything in a new perspective. He looked down at the boy, really looked at him for the first time, and saw not just a child, but a reflection of everything he had lost and everything he might still save. The boy left soon after, called by his mother's voice, echoing from somewhere in the warehouse. He gave Carlo one last look, those old eyes holding a wisdom that shouldn't exist in someone so young, and then he disappeared back into the shadows from which he had emerged. The soft scraping of his toy car's wheels faded, and Carlo was alone again. But the solitude felt different now. The warehouse, which had always been a place of emptiness and cold calculation, suddenly seemed oppressive. The walls that had protected his operations now felt like a prison. The silence that had been his companion for so many years now screamed with all the things he had refused to acknowledge. Carlo stood at the sink for a long time, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The water had stopped running, the blood long since washed away, but his hands still felt dirty, not with the physical evidence of tonight's work, but with the accumulated weight of 15 years of choices that had led him further and further from the man he once was. He thought about the boy's mother, this woman who cleaned up after his violence, who worked in the shadows of his empire to provide for her son. She had noticed things about him, had seen his pain, even though he tried so hard to hide it. She had told her son about a man who used to smile, implying that she believed that man might still exist somewhere beneath the layers of armor and anger. The realization hit him then, sudden and undeniable. He had become exactly what he had always feared. Growing up on the streets of Newark, watching his own father descend into the same patterns of violence and control, young Carlo had sworn he would be different. He had told himself that if he ever had power, he would use it to protect people, to make the neighborhood safer, to be a man his family could be proud of. But somewhere along the way, protection had turned into domination, safety had become fear, and pride had transformed into terror. He had justified every escalation, every act of violence, every line crossed, by telling himself it was necessary. The business required it. His position demanded it. His son's death proved it. But standing in this warehouse, remembering Antonio's gentle nature, and hearing a stranger's child speak about choices and consequences, Carlo couldn't hide from the truth anymore. He had built an empire on blood, and blood was all it would ever produce. There would be no redemption in this life, no moment when the scales would balance and the suffering he had caused would be justified by some greater good. The warehouse, the power, the fear, none of it meant anything. It was just a monument to his inability to face the grief that had consumed him. Carlo left the sink and walked through the warehouse, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He passed rooms where deals were made and plans were formed, spaces that had witnessed countless meetings and decisions that affected hundreds of lives. His empire was vast, his influence undeniable. But what had it brought him? Power without purpose, wealth without joy, respect built entirely on fear. He found himself at the main entrance, looking out at the Newark skyline visible in the distance. The city lights twinkled like stars, each one representing lives being lived, families together, people who had found ways to be happy despite hardship. Somewhere in those lights was the boy and his mother, heading home to whatever modest apartment they called their own, probably talking about the strange man they had encountered at the warehouse. What had the boy seen in him? What had made that child approach without fear, speak without hesitation, ask questions that cut straight to the heart of everything Carlo had been running from? Perhaps children simply saw things more clearly, unencumbered by the layers of complexity and justification that adults wrapped around truth. Carlo pulled out his phone, the screen's glow illuminating his face in the darkness. He scrolled through contacts, looking for a name he hadn't called in years. Roberto, his accountant, the man who managed the legitimate businesses that served as a front for the family's operations. It was late, but Roberto would answer. He always did when the Don called. The phone rang twice before a sleepy voice answered. Carlo didn't waste time with pleasantries. He instructed Roberto to pull files on all the warehouse employees, specifically the cleaning staff. He wanted names, addresses, family situations. He wanted to know about the woman who brought her son to work, wanted to understand their circumstances. Roberto asked no questions, promised the information would be ready by morning, and hung up. Carlo stood there with the phone in his hand, already planning. The boy had mentioned debts, had implied financial struggles. That could be fixed. Money was one thing Carlo had in abundance, and unlike most of his resources, it could actually do some good in the right hands. But as he formed the plan, something else stirred in his mind, a memory he had suppressed for 15 years. After Antonio's funeral, after the retaliation had been carried out and the rival family eliminated, Carlo had stood in the church where his son's casket had rested. The priest, an old man who had known Carlo since childhood, had approached him and spoken words that Carlo had refused to hear at the time. The priest had said that vengeance would never fill the void left by loss, that violence only created more violence, that the only way to honor Antonio's memory was to become the man Antonio had believed his father could be. Carlo had walked away without responding, had never returned to that church, had convinced himself that the priest was naive and didn't understand the realities of their world. But the words had stayed with him, buried deep but never quite forgotten. And now, standing in the warehouse doorway with a boy's innocent questions echoing in his mind, those words resurfaced with undeniable force. Antonio had believed in him. His son had seen something in him worth believing in, some potential for goodness that transcended the family business and the violent legacy they were born into. What if the boy at the warehouse had seen that same thing? What if there was still time to become someone different, someone better? The thought was terrifying, because it meant acknowledging that the last 15 years had been a waste, that he had spent over a decade running from a truth he should have faced. But it was also strangely hopeful, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change course. Carlo made a decision then, standing in the darkness with the cold November wind cutting through the open door. Tomorrow he would take the first steps toward a different path. He would help the boy's family, yes, but more than that, he would begin the process of dismantling the worst aspects of his empire. There were legitimate businesses that could be expanded, could provide jobs and income without the violence and corruption. There were younger members of the family who could be steered toward legal operations, given opportunities that didn't involve crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. It wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance from those who benefited from the current structure, challenges from rivals who would see any change as weakness. But Carlo had built this empire through force of will and strategic thinking. Surely he could apply those same skills toward creating something different, something that wouldn't require washing blood off his hands in abandoned warehouses. The phone buzzed in his hand, a text from one of his lieutenants asking about the next day's operations. Carlo stared at the message, then typed a reply postponing the meeting. He needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to navigate a transformation that would shock everyone who knew him. As he put the phone away, his eyes caught sight of something on the ground near the doorway. The boy's toy car lay there, red plastic gleaming dully in the ambient light. He must have dropped it on his way out. Carlo bent down and picked it up, turning the small object over in his hands. It was worn and scratched, clearly well-loved despite its cheap construction. The kind of toy a parent bought when money was tight, but they wanted to give their child something to make them smile. Antonio had loved toy cars too, Carlo remembered. His room had been full of them. Intricate die-cast models, remote-controlled vehicles, simple plastic toys like this one. He had raced them across the floor, created elaborate scenarios and stories, lost himself in imagination that required nothing more than these simple objects and his own creativity. Carlo closed his fist around the toy car and felt something break inside him, some final wall that had been holding everything back. Tears came then, sudden and unexpected, rolling down his face without permission. He didn't try to stop them. He stood there in the doorway of the warehouse and cried for the first time in 15 years, for Antonio, for the man he had become, for all the lives damaged by his choices, for the time that could never be recovered. When the tears finally stopped, Carlo felt different, not lighter exactly, but clearer, like a fog had lifted, and he could finally see the landscape around him without distortion. The path ahead would be difficult, perhaps impossible, but at least now he could see it. He pocketed the toy car, intending to return it to the boy, and locked the warehouse behind him. His car was parked in the shadows, armored and nondescript, the kind of vehicle that attracted no attention. But instead of getting in and driving home to his empty mansion, Carlo stood beside it, looking up at the night sky. The stars were barely visible through the city's light pollution, but he could make out a few of them, distant and unchanging. Antonio used to point out constellations, had learned their names and stories from library books he checked out obsessively. Carlo wondered if his son could see him now, if there was any truth to the idea that the dead watched over the living. And if Antonio could see him, what would he think of the man his father had become? The question hurt, but it also clarified everything. Carlo knew exactly what Antonio would think. He would be disappointed but not surprised, saddened but still hopeful. Because that's who Antonio had been. He had always believed in second chances, in the possibility of change, in the fundamental goodness he thought existed in everyone. It was time, Carlo decided, to prove that his son's faith hadn't been entirely misplaced. Dawn was breaking over Newark as Carlo drove through streets he had known his entire life. The city was waking up. Delivery trucks making their rounds, early shift workers heading to factories and hospitals, the first hints of the daily chaos that defined urban life. Carlo saw all of it with new eyes, noticing details he had ignored for years. He drove past the church where Antonio's funeral had been held, the building still standing after all this time, its stone facade weathered but enduring. Carlo slowed the car, staring at the entrance, remembering the young priest's words that he had dismissed so long ago. On impulse, he pulled over and parked. The church was unlocked, open for early morning services. Carlo pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the cool, dim interior. The smell of incense and old wood enveloped him, triggering memories of Sundays from his childhood, before the family business consumed everything, when his mother still believed her sons might choose a different path. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The pews were worn smooth by generations of worshippers, the stained glass windows just beginning to glow with the rising sun's light. At the altar, candles flickered, left burning by the priest or perhaps by someone who had come to pray in the night. Carlo stopped halfway down the aisle, unable to make himself go further. He wasn't sure he had the right to approach the altar, wasn't sure he believed in anything anymore beyond the weight of his own choices, but he stood there, hands clasped in front of him, the toy car still in his pocket pressing against his leg. He thought about what to say, how to address a God he wasn't sure was listening, how to articulate the complex mix of regret and determination that filled him. In the end, he settled for simplicity, whispering words that felt inadequate but honest. He confessed that he missed Antonio every single day, that not an hour passed without thinking of his son. He admitted that he had become lost in the grief, had let it transform him into something his son would have been ashamed of. And he made a promise, not to some divine power he wasn't sure he believed in, but to Antonio's memory and to himself, that he would try to be better, that he would use whatever time he had left to make different choices. As he stood there in the silence of the church, Carlo felt a strange sense of peace, not complete and not permanent, but real nonetheless. The journey ahead would be long and painful, filled with resistance and setback, but at least he had taken the first step. At least he had acknowledged the truth instead of running from it. He left the church as the sun rose fully over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The beauty of it struck him. When had he last noticed a sunrise? When had he last paused to appreciate anything beyond strategy and survival? His phone buzzed with the information Roberto had compiled overnight. Carlo read through the file on the boy's mother, Maria Santos, a widow who had lost her husband to cancer 3 years ago, struggling to make ends meet on cleaning jobs that paid minimum wage. Behind on rent, medical bills from her husband's treatment still outstanding, and yet somehow managing to raise a son who approached strange men with kindness instead of fear. Carlo made several calls from his car, each one setting pieces in motion. By noon, Maria Santos would discover that her debts had been mysteriously paid in full, that an anonymous benefactor had established a trust fund for her son's education, that a better job with proper benefits had become available at one of the Mancini family's legitimate businesses. Carlo arranged it so the connection would never be traced back to him. He didn't want gratitude or recognition, just the knowledge that he had used his power for something other than destruction. But that was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, Carlo began the delicate process of restructuring his empire. He met with his most trusted lieutenants, explaining that operations would be changing, that the focus would shift from the illegal activities that had made them powerful to the legitimate businesses that could sustain them without the constant threat of violence. The resistance was immediate and fierce. Many in the organization had known nothing but the criminal life, couldn't imagine another way to operate. Some accused Carlo of going soft, of betraying the legacy his father had built. A few even questioned whether he was still fit to lead. Carlo handled each challenge with the same iron will that had built his empire, but now directed toward a different purpose. Those who couldn't adapt to the new direction were forced out. Their severance packages generous, but their departure non-negotiable. Those who showed willingness to change were given opportunities to learn legitimate trades, to run legal operations, to become businessmen instead of criminals. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the fact that Carlo was fighting against decades of precedent and his own reputation. But every time he felt himself wavering, every time the old patterns of thinking tempted him back toward easier, more violent solutions, he would remember the boy standing in the warehouse asking if he missed his son. Months passed. The transformation was slow and far from complete, but progress was undeniable. The Mancini family began to look more like a business conglomerate and less like a criminal organization. There were still connections to the old ways. You couldn't erase decades of history overnight, but the direction was clear. Carlo found himself spending more time in legitimate boardrooms and less time in abandoned warehouses. He discovered that building something positive required just as much strategy and cunning as destroying enemies. But the victories felt different. No one bled for his profits anymore. No one disappeared because they posed a threat. The empire was smaller but cleaner, less powerful but more sustainable. And through it all, Carlo thought about Antonio. He visited his son's grave regularly now, something he hadn't been able to do for years. He told Antonio about the changes, about the boy in the warehouse, about the attempt to become someone worth remembering. He didn't know if his son could hear him, but speaking the words aloud helped anyway. One evening, 6 months after that night in the warehouse, Carlo found himself driving through the same neighborhood where Maria Santos lived. He wasn't there for business. He simply wanted to see how they were doing, to verify that his anonymous assistance had made a real difference. He parked across the street from their apartment building and watched as the boy, whose name he had learned was Miguel, played with other children in a small courtyard. The toy car had been replaced with a bicycle, bright red and clearly new. Miguel was laughing, racing the other kids, living the kind of carefree childhood that should be every child's right. Maria emerged from the building, calling her son in for dinner. She looked different too. Less worn down, more hopeful. The weight of constant financial stress had lifted from her shoulders, visible in the way she moved and smiled. Carlo watched them disappear into the building, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt something that wasn't pain or anger or emptiness. It wasn't quite happiness. He wasn't sure he deserved that yet. But it was close. It was purpose. It was meaning. It was the sense that his existence might actually matter for something beyond fear and violence. He drove away as the streetlights began to glow in the gathering dusk, heading back to his office where more work waited. The transformation was far from over. There were still challenges ahead, still people who wanted the old Carlo to return, still moments when the temptation to solve problems the easy way felt overwhelming. But every time he felt that pull toward the darkness, he would reach into his pocket where he kept Miguel's toy car, the one he had never returned. He would hold the small plastic object and remember that night in the warehouse, remember the question that had changed everything. Remember that somewhere out there was a boy who had seen something in him worth believing in. The road ahead was long and uncertain. Redemption, Carlo had learned, wasn't a destination you reached, but a direction you traveled, day after day, choice after choice. There would be setbacks and failures, moments when he fell short of the man he was trying to become, but he was trying, and that had to count for something. As he pulled into the parking garage beneath his office building, Carlo's phone buzzed with a message from Roberto. The quarterly report showed that the legitimate businesses were finally turning the kind of profits that could sustain the organization without any illegal operations. It was a milestone, proof that the vision he had been working toward was actually possible. Carlo sat in his car for a moment, the toy car in his hand, thinking about all the roads he hadn't taken, all the choices he could never undo. He thought about Antonio and the man his son had believed his father could be. He thought about Miguel and Maria Santos, about second chances and the possibility of change. And then he thought about the question that had started all of this, the words spoken by a child in a warehouse where blood had been washed from hands too many times to count. Yes, Carlo thought, finally allowing himself to smile, a genuine expression that felt foreign but not unwelcome on his face. Yes, I miss him every day, and that's why I'm trying to be better, because he deserved a father who was worth missing. The answer felt right, not complete, not perfect, but honest and real, and for now, in this moment, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and second chances, please subscribe to our channel for more emotionally powerful narratives that explore the complexity of human nature and the possibility of change. Every story we share reminds us that it's never too late to choose a different path, that even in our darkest moments, hope can find us in unexpected ways. Thank you for joining us on this journey.